Thank you for joining this CIBSE EPG Power Hour on Do we need regulation to meet net zero in offices? My name's Helen Gavin. I'm your host for this session, and we have a number of speakers who are very expert in the subject who will be giving their opinion to help you formulate your mind, or maybe confirm or change your existing views. But just a way of context for this, the Carbon Brief estimated that by the end of last year, the UK was now halfway towards meeting its target of net zeros, because emissions were about 51% of that below 1990 levels. Emissions declined really quickly last year, but are going to rebound for sure. We are on track to meet net zero, but at the moment, we've done a lot of the easy hanging fruit. Now, many emissions come from our built housing stock, and it's true that for the non-domestic properties, about 2/3 of EPCs, energy performance certificates, are C or D rated. So a lot needs to be done there. And in fact, over 2019 and 2020, the GBC, the Green Building Council, published research and guidance that suggested that the office sector should reduce energy demand by an average of 60% by 2050 in order to help the UK meet its net zero and Paris Agreement targets. But there has been some progress, because by January 2020, about 11 offices across Liverpool and Greater Manchester were verified as net zero carbon under the GBC's definition. These have been subsequently followed by other claims for other offices. Interestingly, last month, the UK government said that from September 2021, firms bidding for contracts above £5 million need to show their commitment to net zero by having published a carbon reduction plan. So if we look at the office sector meeting net zero, well, we can see that those companies that own the offices that they occupy have more freedom to implement energy efficiency installations, such as LEDs or solar panels. But what about if you're leasing a building? What are the issues you come across? What are the possible solutions? This is what we'll be exploring in this webinar. So I'm very glad that you have joined us for this. So before we move on to our speakers, I'd like Roger Macklin, who's chair of the EPG group, just to say a few words. Roger.
Helen, thank you so much for that. Welcome all to an early power hour. We normally do in the afternoon. This is a nice change. I just wanted to very briefly introduce the CIBSE Energy Performance Group to you. We have a particular mission, which I hope you can now see on the slides there. I won't read it to you. Hopefully, you can all read it yourselves. It's all to do with energy and performance, as defined by the name. In addition to that, there is a website. We're part of the CIBSE website. You can find us if you just looked for CIBSE and EPG. You can join the EPG. You don't actually have to be a member of CIBSE, but we would very much encourage you to do so. Nevertheless, I think we are collectively the largest group within CIBSE, because clearly this is an important topic for us all. The EPG does a number of things. One of the things is to produce what are called carbon bites. Carbon bites are very short, one-page introductions or summaries of a particular topic. They're all hosted on the CIBSE website. And I would encourage you to go and have a look at those. It's a 30-second read, but it's a nice quick brief on those particular topics. And then the other thing we do, among the other things we do, the primary thing we do is these power hours. These power hours are meant to be collecting some of the finest minds in the industry to talk about a particular topic, which we choose. And the intention is that it only does go on for an hour. So I've already cut into a number of the speaking slots. What I would very much encourage you to do is please do post your comments and your questions in the chat pane. We're hoping to get a dialogue going on that. Enjoy the hour. Helen.
Thank you very much, Roger. Now, first up is Debbie Hobbs. Debbie, can I ask you to share your screens, please? Okay.
There we go. That should be coming through.
Okay, just put it into presentation mode, if you can. Right, so let me introduce Debbie. Debbie Hobbs is the ISG Group Director of Sustainable Business, managing a team of sustainability and social value experts. She is a building physicist and chartered engineer with 32 years of experience in the sustainability and carbon management sector, and is passionate about delivering net zero carbon buildings which use sustainable materials for a circular economy and which add value to the local community. Debbie, over to you.
Thanks, Helen. I'm just going to do a brief 2 or 3 minutes this morning just to set the scene of the challenge of getting our offices in the UK to net zero carbon. So I'm just going to whiz through, which I hope everybody understands, is to get our offices to net zero carbon, they have to be super energy efficient. They have to be, as Helen alluded to, 55 to 70 kilowatt hours per metre squared per year in operation of the energy they're using off the grid. So that in 2050, all our grid is from renewables or zero carbon sources, and we're only using a fraction of what we use today in our offices. To give you an idea, the current office uses about 230 to 250 kilowatt hours per metre squared. So we're talking about getting down to a fifth of the energy we currently use. Now, what I'm thinking about particularly today is existing building stock, not the new build. And when you look at the landlord and tenant market, as you'll see on the right of this slide, there are a number of players involved. It's quite a challenge to get all these aligned. You've got the people who own the building, the people who may then manage it as part of a pension fund. They then give that responsibility to an agent, the likes of JLL, CBRE, and they manage the building. But then on top of that, they have a supply chain who then also have to get on board to operate the building to 55 kilowatt hours and maintain it. And on top of that, you've got this tricky area of having occupiers. So the occupiers of the building are what drive the pension funds. They provide the income for our pensions, but they also then have to have a legal agreement, the lease, and the lease has to bind the occupiers and the owners to achieve this target. And as far as I know, that's never been agreed in a commercial lease with penalties on either side. Simon might prove me wrong. But then the occupiers themselves also have a supply chain who operate the building. They sometimes employ their own property manager if they're large enough. They will have their own ESG manager. They will have their own maintenance company. They will have their own maintenance engineers coming to the site. And hopefully somewhere they will have somebody operating their building. So I just wanted to set the scene of whether all these people could come together to operate a building at 55 kilowatt hours per metre squared without the need for regulation. Because in my career, I've worked in the property sector, I've worked as a consultant, and I've not yet seen this happening, but I've seen lots of barriers in the way. So I think I'm going to leave it there, Helen, because it's a quick intro, and let the speakers tell us more.
Thank you very much, Debbie. Okay, so just to let you know the format of our event today, we're going to hear from 4 more speakers, and then we're going to have a Q&A session at the end. So please pop your questions into the chat pane as soon as you have them. Our speakers may respond during the event before the Q&A, but if you have a question for a particular person, please note their name. And also if there's a particular slide that you'd like to refer to, please refer to the slide number if you can, as that helps as well. So, but let us move on to Simon Keane. Simon, can you share your slides, please? So Simon Keane is a counsel in Hogan Lovells London real estate team, where he advises investors, occupiers, and developers on a wide range of UK real estate transactions. He has a particular interest in sustainability and energy performance and has extensive knowledge of the real estate issues arising from them. He regularly advises clients and colleagues on green leasing generally, and in particular on EPCs, ESOS, minimum energy efficiency standards, design for performance and net zero, and is involved in a number of relevant industry bodies and committees. Simon has helped draft several institutional investors to draft their green leasing policies and standard clauses, and has inputted to the drafting of the model commercial lease. Simon, over to you.
Thank you very much, Helen. So good morning, everybody. I thought I should nail my colours to the mast early doors on this question of whether or not we need regulation. And I think categorically the answer is yes, we do. The real question, though, is why? And I think there are three critical reasons that we need to think about. Firstly, and perhaps the most important one, but the easiest one to gloss over, is that about 80% of the buildings that will exist in 2050 are already standing today. So if we're going to get to net zero, we need to do something about the existing building stock. Add to that the fact that not every building that stands is leased. A lot of them are owned and occupied by the same person, and therefore relying on a landlord-tenant relationship to drive change is not going to touch those buildings. But even where you are relying on the landlord and tenant relationship and what you can get into leases, there is a problem with that as well, which is that leases are negotiated, and not everything that you might want to get into your lease is what your counterparty might like to see there. So let's just dwell on lease negotiations for a bit. One of the big problems that we face, despite some more well-minded, well-intended people coming through the industry at the moment, is that landlord and tenant lease negotiations are adversarial still. People tend to take polar positions and eventually find some kind of middle ground, but it's a difficult process. There's a number of reasons for that, which I won't get into, but just focusing on the green agenda and net zero, we do see that a lot of landlords and tenants are just not interested in it. From a landlord perspective, yes, we've got the big boys out there in the market, the big institutions, the pension funds that Debbie was mentioning and so on. But there's also a whole range of small landlords who might just own one or two buildings, maybe a high street shop, or a small business park or a small industrial site on the edge of a very small town or village. And that is just an individual, maybe one of us around the table, who just has an asset in their own personal investment. And they might be looking at that for their personal pension, that might be their own personal business, but they're not a large institutional landlord who gets all the advice and has the resource to deal with net zero. Another of the blockers is that there's a lot of concern over the effect of onerous clauses in leases. From a landlord's perspective, the concern is open market rent reviews. If you've got something in your lease that is off kilter with the rest of the market, then the concern is that the hypothetical tenant bidding in the open market would pay less for that lease because it's onerous compared to other leases that it could get. And so the rent doesn't go up as far or doesn't go up at all on review. And from a tenant's perspective, anything that is potentially onerous puts a cost of compliance on them. And so we see retailers in particular striking out everything that they can that they think might cost them money, either directly on the bottom line or through administrative and management costs. And the other aspect is that even where you've got landlords and tenants who want to achieve net zero, the way in which they want to go about it doesn't often coincide. And so you might have landlords trying to put one set of provisions in a lease and the tenant saying that doesn't work for me, I need to do something different. I'm not going to go into the detail of this, but just to give you some food for thought on the sort of questions that come up when we're trying to negotiate leases and deal with some of the green issues. There's a whole range of things that get thrown up that become a blocker to actually getting the end point achieved. And if that comes up when you're negotiating the lease, it's even harder, I'd say almost impossible, to get stuff done if the lease doesn't contemplate it and it's already standing there. I also want to ask whether green leases are even the right way of achieving net zero. They contain all sorts of useful things. There's really good guidance from the likes of the Better Buildings Partnership, for instance. So green leases definitely are a tool, they definitely help, but only to a point. One of the big issues with them is enforcement. Landlords generally don't suffer any kind of loss if the lease isn't performed in this way. And if they don't suffer a loss, they can't really enforce the obligations. What then incentivizes the tenants to comply? And if the landlord's got no loss, why should it bother enforcing and upset its tenant? And a green lease, of course, is still a small minority of the market. There's a whole range of non-green leases out there, and they're likely to stay because many of them will be protected under the 1954 Act, which means that tenants are entitled to the same terms on renewal. So just to wrap up, what might regulation look like? I think the key thing it needs to do is address the split incentive. That is, there need to be obligations on both owners, occupiers and developers to make sure that it's not a question of the landlord spending the capital and the tenant deriving the benefit through reduced utilities bills. We've got good starting points already out there in MEES and neighbours, for instance, but I think we need something that positively requires improvement works to be carried out. We need some sort of enforcement mechanism, so maybe some penalties, but also some incentives, perhaps some tax incentives to encourage people in the right direction. I think we need a better tool than the EPC for measuring performance, because we need something that tells us how a building is actually performing, not what it could do. And we need a statutory definition of net zero so that everybody is aligned on what they're trying to achieve. So for all those reasons, yes, 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 regulation, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. I think we know where you stand on that. That's excellent. So let me just repeat to the audience, if you have any questions, please pop them into the chat pane. You're not allowed to unmute yourself, but please express your views via the chat. We're going to move on to Simon King, another of our speakers. So Simon, yes, thank you. If you could share your slides. Simon King is the Director of Sustainability and Social Value at Mitie, a major facilities management company. Simon is responsible for leading Mitie's Plan Zero commitment to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050. This includes a pledge to switch its entire fleet of over 7,000 cars and vans to ultra-low emissions by that date. Simon, over to you.
Thanks very much, Helen, and thanks for the intro. Yeah, just one key point. Plan Zero is we're committed to net zero by 2025 for our own operational emissions. So, and the fleet by the same date. So, yeah, 25 years ahead of that 2050 target that the overall UK has. So thanks very much for joining the webinar today. I'm going to try and give that sort of occupier perspective, and I guess from two lenses. One, Mitie clearly have our own buildings that we operate, and also, as that pink pillar on Debbie's slide at the beginning showed so clearly, we do quite a bit of those value chains for clients as well. So I'm going to try and give a bit of perspective from both of those angles. Just to quickly summarize on Plan Zero, and the reason I think this is relevant, I'll come on to in just a second, but we have laid out very clearly that we're going to be at net zero by 2025 for all of our operational emissions, and we've got a process that we use to get there using the expertise that we've got across our business. So, and I absolutely acknowledge we're very fortunate to have that expertise within our business. Many occupiers of buildings don't have that and are dependent upon other organizations to bring it in. And so I guess if you take some of my comments, and I'm going to go through in the context of, even for an organization which does this for clients, we have big challenges. And so I think that will probably lead you to conclude where I'm going to summarize, and it's not different to Simon. So engaging with landlords, first thing that we found works really well is being clear on what you're doing and why. And that's one of the reasons why Plan Zero really helps us, because we are then able to say, this is what we are committed to, this is what we are going to deliver. And therefore we have these expectations of you. And if you're not able to meet them, that's going to influence our decision-making for the future. If it's just, the GB as a whole needs to get to net zero by 2050, it doesn't have quite the same weight. Then our view and what's worked for us is that we take that ownership of the emissions, even when it's a shared occupancy building, us occupying that, they are in effect our emissions. And so how can we try and create our own net zero pathway, regardless almost of the landlord? But absolutely acknowledging that things like metering that Simon mentioned and that data set sharing can be real barriers, and we are installing sub-meters and so on. But of course, we do need landlord support to do that. One of the things that's worked very well where we're going into new buildings for Mitie, not necessarily brand new buildings, but buildings we're moving into, is, and again, as Simon said at the beginning, before the lease is signed, what are those energy efficiency and net zero solutions, and get those agreed early on so that they're part of the mobilisation and the building goes live with those changes already made. And to help us with that decision making, we've created a carbon conscious building selection guide, which we then use to say, okay, what are the requirements that we have of a building? And that building either needs to meet those, or we make those changes prior to moving in to that building and mobilising it for Mitie. But we do see masses of short-term thinking and resistance to engaging in net zero from landlords, and so regulation is absolutely required. For example, I had one landlord recently really concerned that if we installed electric vehicle charging points, who was going to take them out at the end of the lease and what was going to happen to the DLAPs. And you go, well, hang on, everyone is going to want electric charging points in every building in the very near term. Why are you even asking this question? But it's just indicative of the sorts of challenges that we see. I thought it was also worth just touching on the Climate Change Committee report, because my perspective is all well and good. But if you look at the people who are advising government, then their take is absolutely we need regulation, because there are a lot of people who are setting targets, but actually the policies don't come through and back these up. And these are direct quotes out of their report from last month. They also highlight that building emissions were falling, and they fell 7% between 2009 and 2016. And in that period, there were policy packages in place. They've since fallen away, and we've seen that the emissions have risen since then. So a pretty strong indication that regulation helps. They're also advising government that businesses need to be encouraged, but also required to invest in the right solutions. And for one of the reasons I'll come on to in a moment on pricing, there are currently some real barriers to organisations making those changes. We believe that zero carbon for zero cost is possible if you structure a net zero pathway in the right way with the right interventions at the right time, but it needs to be made easy for everyone to make the right decisions, and financially incentivized always helps with that speed of change. So building decarbonisation is absolutely required, but we're going to need that package of support, that policy support, to make that happen. We know that heat pump rollout is well behind target already, and the targets just get stiffer and stiffer, so that's not a great sign. And at the moment, there's little evidence that we're moving in the right direction. So the Climate Change Committee are absolutely in the same place, saying, yes, we need to take regulation and we need to make a difference here. And if there was one ask that I had from an occupier perspective and from a facilities manager perspective on what could be changed easily that would make a massive difference, I was talking to a major client the other day and trying to understand why they had so much gas still in their mix as you look out to 2030 and 2040. And the straight answer was it's financial. And when you look at the detail behind it, it's not surprising. The percentage of the cost of electricity, which is down to renewables and non-commodities, is 36%. So you pay more in climate change levies on electricity than you do for your entire gas. And so that differential is driven largely by those levies, and that could easily be adjusted so that people are massively incentivized to switch to electricity. And that could be done focused on the commercial sector as opposed to the residential sector as well. So one easy sort of solution that I would encourage. So in summary, energy optimization makes sense, but we're seeing low uptake. The policy interventions have worked, but they're not there now. And there are many leading organizations that are committed to making it happen, and many of them on the call today, but we need to get landlord support. I would say for occupiers that the best thing to do is take a proactive approach to pressure landlords to make things happen. But the reality is there are huge challenges, and if a regulatory framework is in place, then we will be able to overcome them. I share the sort of views expressed so far that without that, we're wishing rather than being certain that it will occur. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Simon. Okay, let us move on to our next speaker, Alastair Mumford. Can you share your slides, please, Alastair? Okay, Alastair Mumford is the Corporate Energy Manager for Devon County Council and the Regional Programme Manager for the South West Energy Partnership between Bristol, Plymouth and the Devon authorities. He has worked in the low carbon sector as project manager and sector development programs consultant, and is currently responsible for the development and delivery of a range of low carbon projects in the areas of building retrofit, electric vehicle infrastructure and renewable energy. Over to you, Alastair.
There we go. I'm actually having some retrofit on the house at the moment, so hopefully there won't be any power tools operating for the next 6 minutes. We'll have to hope for that. Yes, I think in short, we definitely need regulation for the reasons set out by the previous speakers and also by Carl after myself. I suppose what my context for it is going to be more is focusing really on retrofit and public buildings, so non-domestic buildings. And from my point of view, the regulation maybe is a bit more about guidance really, but it is definitely needed. And one of the main ones is, what is net zero? We've heard previous speakers talk about the 55 kilowatt hours per square metre that UK Green Building Council and REBA seem to have concluded on for retrofit of non-domestic buildings. But it's really tough to get obviously down to 55, and every kilowatt when you're getting down to that area is going to be more and more expensive. Maybe exponential is the right phrase, but I often get told that I use that in the wrong context. But anyway, it gets harder and harder. So we really need to get as good a target for energy use for the building as possible. And having looked into the targets from REBA and UK GBC, maybe the science behind that, or the approach to that is maybe not as rigorous as possible really, and that's not to be derogatory towards them, because it's great work they've done in raising all of this. And if we look at some of the other standards around there, so you've got ENERFIT, which is the retrofit standard from Passive House. Passive House is a large standard for achieving great performing buildings. But even for that one, in there, there's a performance specification, and it states what the kilowatt hours per square metre is to be. But that basis really is in building efficiency and the environment rather than carbon. And so there is substantial risk when you start to think about embodied carbon that you're not going to be achieving net zero. Another approach that we looked at, Energiesprong, which is a whole building approach using off-site construction methods with a design and build contract and then a performance guarantee. That is a very detailed performance specification in there. It's a really good specification, but it's more designed for sort of small buildings. So though it has the basis in carbon, it's maybe a bit more difficult for us to transfer into the non-domestic area. So we've got 2 projects at the moment, and we're looking at following government funding, and so we've had to sort of, we wanted to try and build our own specification. We're trying to strike a sort of pragmatic balance between carbon reduction achieved and the capital investment that's going to be made. And flexibility has been allowed wherever possible to try and make sure the design can reflect these aspects in the building and so forth. So we've got no stated kilowatt hour per square metre objective, but we've gone for the idea of having a life cycle costing for the proposed design that must be no more than the life cycle cost of the existing building design over a 60-year period. Stating that there must be a fabric first approach, stating, minimum internal surface temperatures and so forth, but also importantly that there's a whole life carbon life cycle assessment for 60 years, and that should be lower than the current building without improvements. So the hope is that that specification can deliver the most appropriate zero carbon solution for the building and the budget that's available. Next one is around, making sure that we actually get the performance that the design is saying we're going to get. And there is this performance gap there. We're not seeing design performance in use, and we cannot afford to do that. We have to achieve the carbon savings that are in that the design is going to give. So how do we do that? Energy performance contracting and Energiesprong as well. They both use sort of long-term agreements. I get very concerned about the validity. It seems to be just kicking problems down the road or kicking bun fights between you and contractors down the road, which I just don't know whether that's really the most appropriate way to do it. ENERFIT, the retrofit version of Passive House, that uses more of a, get the building done right. We'll get the design done right, get the building done right. And I think that's what I prefer, get it right. And that's, so we're looking to use things like construction checklists, self-certification by the contractor. There are some concerns around that. So maybe we need some good employers agents, and also regular air tightness tests as well. And then commissioning, really important commissioning, using the soft landings, using thermal imaging, doing post-occupancy evaluation. And then lastly, what's difficult for ourselves is around, how do we get our money back when we don't see the benefit? So we do have some properties which we rent out to other organisations. And so how do we justify making that investment in there when we're not going to see the energy savings? So we need ways to finance these investments. And I think one of the ways would be to move more to service plans. So the building owner has some control over the building energy payments. And that's where I think the Energiesprong again is a great sort of a very simple methodology for that. So they're doing most of their work up to date really has been in the social housing sector, and for that, you know, normally on the left hand side your energy bills is being paid for by the tenant, and the rent then goes to the housing association. Moving more to a situation where there's a service charge with both the energy bills and the rent going to the housing association. So when the housing association makes that investment and reduces the cost of those energy bills, they can either decide to transfer none of that saving to the tenant or some of it, but take that little gap there and use that to keep to reinvest in refurbishment and to pay back on the investment that they've made. So that's my 3 points really, but yes, I think we definitely do need regulation because it's a very important area of work. Thank you, Helen.
Thank you very much, Alastair. So we've got a bit of a trend here with our speakers so far, all confirming that yes, regulation will be needed. If you disagree with this, please put your comment into the chat pane. But last but by no means least, our last speaker is Carl Brooks. So Carl, can you share? Thank you. So Carl Brooks is a director at CBRE and it's head of sustainability for the property management business. He has worked for over 20 years in sustainability, with the last 14 years in the real estate sector. And having worked on both the owner or developer side and the property management side, Carl has a broad view on the application of and challenges around delivering sustainability within commercial property for investor clients. Carl, over to you.
Thanks, Helen. Morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here this morning to bring forward the views on this question from a property management perspective. So just quickly to begin, a very quick slide on CBRE to help set the scene of our breadth of knowledge internally. So within the advisory division of our business, we're fortunate to be involved across all stages of the built environment life cycle and have been working hard internally to ensure that sustainability exists as a horizontal service line, given the obvious synergies between each of the stages. My principal focus at CBRE, both for today's session and in my day-to-day kind of role, is on the operational stage of the life cycle and on the integration of sustainability into our service line, including, of course, net zero carbon preparation for our clients. Our property management business retains management of around 6,000 assets across all asset classes in the UK, which is around 380 million square feet under management. So we're fortunate to have a really broad view of performance across a range of asset classes, both within the UK and beyond into our global property management business. As for everyone, sustainability, or ESG, has exploded over the last 3 years, particularly, really since the Paris Climate Agreement. And in that time, a number of challenges have converged, giving the rising appreciation of the interdependencies that exist between them. Our clients are setting long-term targets around ESG more broadly, and carbon reduction most prominently, aimed not only as a response to the climate crisis and investor pressure for action, but also around exploring and realising co-benefits relating to various aspects of user experience and their connection with the building systems and their management. There is also, of course, a rising level of understanding around the impact of inaction on future value and potential obsolescence or stranding risk, driven by new voluntary frameworks. You're really driven in part by these frameworks, and forecast activity is growing around framing the net zero issue, as been mentioned by some speakers earlier on today. Arguably for us, most notably the work that the UK GBC did, who have suggested that in order to be Paris proof, i.e. to kind of have a portfolio that meets that 1.5 degrees, property owners should be seeking to improve asset performance in operation to the equivalent of a B-rated display energy certificate, so an operational rating, or a 6 stars neighbours rating. So this translates as an energy use intensity figure of around 70 kilowatt hours per metre squared per year for the whole building. So which is kind of relatively easy to understand in kind of pictures, but where are we now? So based on the last iteration of the real estate environmental benchmark, which is the Better Buildings Partnerships benchmark, which is developed using their own members' data, typical practice for an air-conditioned office building is around 233 kilowatt hours per metre squared, meaning we're looking at around a 70% reduction is needed from typical and around 59% from good practice cohorts within that group. This benchmark is updated each year, and with the BBP's growth in membership recently and the opportunity via the Managing Agents Partnership, which I chair for the BBP, to submit non-member data, the sample will increase and the quality of the benchmark will improve further. So back to achieving net zero. If we just buy renewables and offset, that's job done, right? Well, no, it's not. That's not the case. also from the UK GBC, they suggest that the energy supply in 2050, based on the planned growth in renewables, will only reach 39% of the current demand for energy, meaning that net zero is only really possible by investment in additional new renewables and a sharper focus on energy reduction. These must be the priorities in the planning for the low carbon future we know we need to achieve. Offsetting is and must always be the last resort. Based on the modelling around decarbonisation pathways developed by CREM, which is the Carbon Risk Real Estate Monitor, GRES, which is the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark, apologies for the acronyms, have estimated that around 50% of commercial real estate assets will strand by 2035 at the latest, if no carbon reduction measures are implemented. This research makes the investment case for carbon reduction far more compelling. Stranded assets will, at best, see a significant reduction in both their market value and attractiveness to existing and potential occupiers. To better understand the reality of the CREM pathways, within CBRE, we've worked up an example using one of our own offices, which, based on the data, had actually already stranded back in 2019. On the chart here, the dotted line shows that even with the planned grid decarbonisation path, this particular asset stays stranded, making investment essential. Interventions made this year, namely addressing the control strategy and delivering small-scale relamping projects, for example, along with scheduled boiler replacements with heat pumps in 2024 and the installation of on-site photovoltaics in 2030, are projected to deliver a sufficient improvement to delay the stranding point to 2036. After which there's a need to think outside the building and enter into a power purchase agreement and finance an off-site renewable project to add essential renewable capacity to help close the gap between demand and supply. However, even with these measures taken into account, the building is still projected to strand in 2042, leaving us to hope that the new low or zero carbon technology has been developed by then to make further improvements without having to start looking at building fabric. So reductions are possible, as we've seen, and investment risk makes interventions likely to be supported, but this action may still mean we fall short. The question of this morning was whether regulation is needed to stimulate action, and my view is, much like the other speakers this morning, is that yes, regulation is needed. Pledges don't seem to be enough in terms of performance at the building level, or indeed at industry level. The MSCI published analysis earlier this year that shows government pledges take us to at best 3 degrees of warming by the end of the century. If we add in the corporate pledges into the mix, we may achieve 2.3 degrees, still falling short of the Paris commitment. While there's a chance that investor pressure or the increased risk to value for owners may deliver the impetus needed, regulation will force action, but it has to be effective regulation, effectively regulated. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carl. So we have now concluded the presentations from our speakers, so we can move on to the Q&A. And there has been a flurry of activity in the chat pane, which is fantastic to see. Now, all the speakers agree that regulation is needed. So my first question to the panel is, what are the barriers in implementing regulation? Yes, I'm sure there are many, but please, speakers, unmute yourself and feel free to chip in with what you think are the barriers to overcome to put regulation in place.
So shall I start off? I think if we're going to have regulation, we need to know what it is that we're trying to achieve. And I think a proper definition of net zero, one that doesn't just rely on offsetting, but actually drives physical change in a building, is absolutely essential. And people who are looking at the chat can see there's a whole line of thought going on that, and how hard it is actually to work out what you're talking about when you say you're striving for net zero. So I think first main barrier is actually being clear on what it is we're trying to achieve.
Shall I come in there, Helen, because I've been putting a lot on the chat. I think, Simon, that's why I'm quite a favour of the target being 55 kilowatt hours per metre square per year of energy going through your meter on the grid, because that means it's very clear and it's measurable. It's the meter and how much energy goes through it, and divide that by your gross internal area every year, and you've got a target. The issue for me as well then comes in is that the responsibility of the landlord or the tenant? Sometimes the tenant's responsible for the whole amount of energy in an FRI, a single lease. Sometimes in other leases, the landlord's responsible for everything except the small power. Sometimes the tenant's responsible for small power and lighting. Sometimes they have their own plant, which also uses energy for meeting rooms and things. So the difficulty has been over the years with the Better Building Partnership looking at energy rating schemes is how you set the target for either the landlord or the occupier and get them to bind into it, because it's very building specific. Hence why Neighbours has been introduced with the Better Building Partnership, because it already has the protocols, the processes, and the sort of methodology of how you might do the landlord energy rating. So yeah, let's just mandate a Neighbours rating into the lease. And if the building owner doesn't actually achieve it, then they rebate the tenant money. Alastair's got his hand up.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think though, Debbie, that one of the reasons the barrier really, Helen, is the complication of this, because we need that target, yeah, whether it's 55 or what, but does it include embodied carbon? Because that's going to be the killer as well. You can really start to get rid of any of the benefits if you depending on, you know, sticking a load of steel in, you know, triple versus double glazing. I don't think triple really stacks up when you look at the embodied carbon. But the obvious one in terms of a barrier is the politics of this. This is all going to cost money. And if we keep on lobbying government to not do this, such as the recent articles around a certain developer, it ain't going to happen. So, you know, we've all got to understand it's going to cost us all money. And it's going to be the government are just going to have to try and make it as painless as possible. But it is going to be painful, really. And I think it's the reality of it, isn't it, really?
I think you're absolutely right, Alastair. And I think recently in some work we did looking at a sustainable buildings monitor, we estimated if it just say it was £2,000 per metre squared of real estate, commercial real estate, that was the cost of upgrading to 55, because by that figure, you're actually doing fabric. You can't really avoid actually changing your fabric unless it's already very super energy efficient and airtight. £2,000 a metre squared across the whole commercial sector is something like £1.2 trillion by 2050. So to give you a figure, it's something like £350 billion a year that needs to be found. And that's only the commercial real estate. So then you look at all the public sector buildings, where's all that money coming from? So the barrier is the money. The battles are about who's going to pay for it. You know, if it was easy and there was no cost, I'm sure people would willingly collaborate and do it tomorrow. You know, it is the cost.
Yes. Carl, Simon King, what do you think?
I tend to agree that it's on the political sort of side in terms of that kind of conflict between sort of regulation and the kind of ability for businesses to conduct themselves and focus on their own businesses. I think like with the article that was being referred to earlier, I think there is a general issue with the way the language around these kind of arguments are sort of made around the sort of cost now, as opposed to looking forward to what the sort of losses would be if we don't act now. And I think by sort of most measures and analyses, the impacts we're going to see by not working to sort of mitigate the worst excesses of the climate crisis are going to be far bigger than the initial costs to upgrade building stock. Or do we just need to get to a position where we accept that there's going to be certain sort of certain buildings or certain locations which will just become undesirable and stranded, and then we just work with that? I don't think the owners of those buildings will view it that way, and I don't think they'll be able to move them on quick enough to any kind of prospective owner who's going to start looking at that long-term risk through their own investment strategies and potentially seek the discounts to the equivalent value of upgrading the building. So I think it's great having these conversations, and I think it's really good that there's more parties involved. But I think at some stage, and hopefully later this year, we will get an operational energy rating mandated by government, and that will be the game changer we need to actually sort of be able to rate buildings by how they're used, not how they are hypothetically designed to perform.
Thanks, Carl. Simon?
There are many people much more qualified than I am in the detail, so I'm not going to try and do that. I think that one of the barriers that we need to overcome is what's that really high level ambition. I think to Simon Keen's point earlier on about what is net zero offset is not the solution. We were talking before the webinar started, Helen, about electric vehicles, for example. And if you look at EVs, the government have banned the sale of internal combustion engine vehicles by 2030 and then plug-in hybrids in 2035. There is a really high level, this is what's happening. There's loads of detail behind that then needs working out to deliver that. But I don't see that same level of ambition or understanding in the building sector to say this is what we absolutely need to deliver, and here are some big decisions that we can make which will drive that change overall. There's loads of detail that then needs working out, but I think we need to start off with that. Here's what we're going to actually deliver, and then we can all sort of get involved in how do we actually make that work. And so that overall guidance, I think, is the starting point.
Yes, absolutely. And that is one of the key reasons for having regulation, is to set in stone that this is the direction in which the country wants to go. This is the way in which we need to take action. But the discussion on cost is very real, because we're talking about an actual cost that needs to be paid by an actual organization or person in with regard to retrofit building, as opposed to the kind of, yes, climate change damages that will happen in the future, but are kind of fuzzy and not directly need to be purchased or paid by an individual. So there's always that dilemma of costs now against future costs, but I might not be responsible for paying them in the future. And we only have to look at Grenfell to see how discussions about who pays for what is getting really bogged down, and that is an issue that's captured the nation. I see there was a post from an audience member who said that in 2010 or 11, there was an attempt to promote DECs with the government, but the Trennet Taid bodies lobbied against it. And I wonder if so much has happened since then that now would be a better time to try and counter the powerful lobby groups from landlords of the building industry to try and put these regulations in place. And it will take time. I know from my experience in the water industry that lobbying to get water efficiency labels put onto appliances has taken 10 years and is now being discussed as possibly being implemented. A similar situation, a similar system to energy efficiency appliances will now be applied to the water efficiency, which is great. So what do our speakers think about how ripe the government may be in hearing these messages to counter kind of powerful voices or lobby groups that are saying, no, we don't need regulation, we can achieve this through endeavours or market forces? Simon Keane, what would you say?
I think the government's already moving in that direction. They are committed to net zero, they've legislated for that. And if you look at the consultations that have come out this year on tightening up MEES, but also in particular on introducing a new performance-based framework for large commercial and industrial buildings, that is very much in the model of Neighbours. It builds on what DECs do by looking at the actual performance of the building rather than just the hypothetical performance from an EPC. And I think from some of the roundtables that I've been involved in with members of BEIS and others, they are actually really committed to driving that through. So it will be interesting to see what the consultation responses look like. But my gut feel is that actually that is a direction of travel that we will see happen.
Would any other speaker like to comment? Yep, go for it, Debbie.
Yeah. I just want to comment because I was involved in getting the decks through last time with UK GBC, and we fought well and hard. We got all the way to the Treasury, and without getting shot down by the retailers, the people who lobbied against it was the retail sector, who have a lot of influence with the Treasury. So if you're a retailer, you're using more energy than nearly any other sector of the UK, and you don't want a label that says you're really bad. You might have had a long history of committing to, sustainable charters and, plans, A, B, or C, let's say, but your buildings are using a lot of energy per metre squared per year. So that was when it failed. The other issue has always been with DECs that it doesn't split the landlord and tenant energy, as I said before. That I think we've overcome now with Neighbours. It's taken about another 3 or 4 years to get that through, and a lot of work, a lot of technical work has gone on behind the scenes to define all the methodology for this. So it's interesting BEIS are now bringing this in for, I think, commercial offices, but I haven't read it recently, Simon, but it certainly doesn't cover the retail sector yet. And I think the area is they're bringing it in for buildings that they can. But my big challenge is, what do we do about retail?
Yeah, so the scheme is buildings over 1,000 square meters, and it's starting with offices, but they're intending to phase it across all asset classes eventually. So it would eventually capture retail with large shopping centres and things, but obviously it won't capture things like a high street unit because they will be smaller than 1,000 metres squared.
And I think the idea is to shame the retail sector into, once you've done it for all the other sectors, you know, there is no real option other than for the retail sector to get on board, I think. So.
Just putting, I guess, a positive view on it, I think we're starting to see across other areas of government where there's really starting to be some significant change. I mean, if you look at, say, the Cabinet Office have recently announced PPN 0621, which is a requirement for all suppliers into central government to have a carbon reduction plan, to be reporting on their emissions, to actually be delivering that, and it's pass fail for supplying to central government. So there's some really quite challenging and innovative approaches being taken. And so and going back to electric vehicles again, I mean, that ban is absolutely leading globally. So I'm hopeful that when we start to things like the heating building strategy, assuming it comes out at some point, I mean, it's been delayed quite a few times, that there will be some really forward thinking and challenging stuff in there, because otherwise we're not going to achieve the targets which government have committed to. So we do need to see those targets translated into policy, but I'm more hopeful that there's going to be some pretty far-reaching stuff coming, because there has to be, otherwise we're not going to get to the targets which have been very clearly committed to.
Does anyone know if the government has put in place any measures to bring its own real estate up to scratch, up to net zero? Because that would be a clear sign. It would be a very good way of showing best case and various case studies to deal with difficult buildings. Anyone know what's happening there? Simon King, you're smiling, so do you know?
So I think it's work in progress, I think, would be the polite summary of that. I would see Debbie sort of laughing as well, but there is a desire to achieve it, but at the moment it's very much department by department, to extend to sub-department by sub-department, building by building, rather than there being a holistic approach. And one of the challenges certainly we see supplying into the public sector is typically a private client. You would do the sort of the analysis and the assessment, and as part of your agreement work on energy optimization, create a plan to then move towards decarbonisation solutions and so on. And it would be a collaboration over a period of time. Given some of the constraints around public sector procurement, it tends to be far more sort of discrete work package by discrete work package, and that joined up approach is not necessarily as easy to achieve in a public sector procurement environment. So hopefully with the recent green paper and so on, and the thinking around public procurement, we may see some change there. But I think that is one of the challenges that we see delivering it in the public sector.
I think the public sector... Oh, sorry, go on, Debbie.
Sorry, I was just going to say, if I could come in, I think we're a pretty good mixture in our turnover of public sector and private sector. And I'm definitely seeing more of the public sector tenders asking for net zero carbon new builds. And particularly in the education sector for schools. So they're very clear, we want zero carbon or we want passive house. And that's really good because everybody starts off with that view in mind. But that's new buildings. It worries me all the buildings we're seeing that aren't net zero carbon now. But it's existing buildings and it's refurbishment. And obviously that's Alastair's specialist area. When you want to refurbish a building to net zero, how do you bind in the design team, the contractor, the people operating your building to make sure that works all the way through? And so I think that's a challenge for the public sector. For the commercial sector, we're still getting major refurbishment tenders that aren't even mentioning net zero carbon, which worries me. So we had one the other day from a large landlord, complete refurbishment of the building back to shell, no mention of the carbon targets. I don't know if Alastair's got any thoughts about the public sector and how quickly you might get there.
Well, it's massively sped up by, sorry, somebody's trying to get hold of me this morning. It's massively sped up by the public sector decarbonisation scheme, although that, along with everything else, has caused now the COVID bubble, which is you know, in some ways, all of this stuff that we're wanting to try and get done, can we just wait a year and then do it next year? Because it's just, you know, don't do it at the moment. Yeah, so, but 100% grant coming through, that's obviously it's a no-brainer. However, I would say that there is, so under public sector decarbonisation scheme, they've got this £500 per tonne of carbon saved limit. You can't do deep retrofit with that kind of limitation. So there is going to be some match needed. So if they've talked about future phases of PSDS, hopefully we'll see phase 3 announced in the winter. So if we've got that, local authorities are going to have to stick in their own money as well. Or we need some finance schemes that can help with that. And yeah, I think it could be possible. You know, most councils are obviously keen to do this. So I think we should see further work going. But it's that understanding, as we were talking about earlier on, what is net zero? Do we include embodied carbon? And then getting the design teams to work out that, and then the performance assurance approaches to make sure it's all gets done. That is still new and unfamiliar ground for, I would say, for most local authorities.
Thank you, Alastair. Simon Keane, I think you wanted to say something else.
Yeah, I was just going to say, as I understand it, one of the reasons for the big success of Neighbours in Australia was that the public sector said that they wouldn't take buildings that came out at less than, I think it was a 4-star or something like that. And if we could have the UK public sector actually taking a similar sort of stance, that would really start to drive the market.
And Simon, what would be needed to get the public sector to adopt that standard?
Well, ultimately a mandate from ministers. I think it all comes down to politics, and if the ministers tell the civil servants that's what they've got to do, then that's what they've got to do. But if the ministers aren't behind it, then the civil servants will carry on looking at how they manage their budgets effectively.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
I think just to add on that particular point, in some ways this is proving to be a bottom-up response to the climate emergency. So I wouldn't say that councils have to have, it would be good for government to say that, but I don't think that has to happen. But they need to understand what the implications of that policy is. So a really important piece of work would be, yeah, what is the impact of that? You know, what's the pounds and pence, so they can understand that and then work to try and get around that. But yeah.
Okay, thank you. So we're coming to the end of our session. We just have a couple of minutes left. So I'd like to give the opportunity for each of our speakers just to give a short summary of what you think, or what you think are the key points you'd like the audience to take away from this session. If we do it in the order in which the speakers appeared. So Debbie, putting you on the spot first of all, what's your key takeaway point?
I think mine is for existing buildings, we need regulation. Let's get these targets built into legislation and penalties if they're not achieved. For new buildings and refurbishments, we need a better contractual route. So let's tie in the designers and the construction industry into how the building operates somehow.
Thanks. Simon Keane.
I think we need regulation because we need to take this out of the scope of a negotiation and into something that just has to be done by everybody. And I mean everybody, not just landlords, but occupiers as well.
Thank you. Simon King.
Again, I agree the regulation is there. I think if there are some levers that can be pulled which impact the commercials, and they gave the electricity and gas example, you can really rebalance that, and I think that will help us drive a long way in the right direction. A lot of people have mentioned budgets and commercials in the chat. If you make it commercially viable, then that moves us a long way forward. But I would also say there is a lot that we can all be doing now. So let's look at what we can do now, whilst also lobbying to go further faster. But take the actions that you can yourself, and really try and move to net zero wherever you possibly can, because we all have a personal obligation and a business obligation to do that.
Brilliant, thank you. Alastair.
Yeah, I suppose that we all need to be ambitious. We've got to go further with this, and I think there is an element of a need for collaboration, that risk sharing. We understand that we can't, we've got to achieve the performance. How do we do that in the best way? And I think that's by working together. So hopefully we'll see more collaboration between all the different stakeholders involved in retrofit.
Carl.
Yeah, Operational ratings are essential. A reset of the relationship between landlords and occupiers is essential. It's that collaboration, that collaborative approach. If we know what a building can consume, energy use intensity, and how that relates to occupier fit outs, then we need to be setting targets around energy use intensity maximums for occupier fit outs, and then there'd be some change in the kind of leasing to drive that. It's not around, it is that sort of split incentive, obviously, but it's a lower cost of occupancy for the occupier and a low carbon future, which we're all trying to achieve. So those are my two sort of takeaways.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Carl. And that brings us to an end of our session. So thank you very much, the speakers. Give them a mini round of applause for everyone. And I hope you have a good day. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.